Pro-government forces recapture more than half of the Syrian city of Aleppo. After nearly 6 years, could this mark a turning point in the country's bloody civil war? Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. It was once Syria's largest city and the country's industrial and financial centre. Now, pro-government forces have pushed deep into the besieged city of Aleppo, taking back territory held by rebel forces since 2012. The Syrian army has reportedly ordered remaining opposition forces to leave or face, quote, inevitable death. The near collapse of the opposition comes amid a report of infighting, with one rebel group attacking another, seizing its ammunition, fuel and food. Backed by the Russian military support and humanitarian assistance from China, President Bashar al-Assad's forces are slowly retaking control, leaving some to wonder whether Russia and China have emerged as effective counterweights to US influence in the region. We'll put that question to our panel and more. But first, we begin with CCTV's Ala Ibrahim in Aleppo. And Ala, what's the latest on the ground there?
We are visiting one of the makeshift shelter centers that the Syrian government has established in Aleppo to accommodate thousands of civilians fleeing rebel-held districts of the city. And the situation here can be easily described as tragic. This is an old factory that was turned into a shelter center, and as you can imagine, the services are very basic. And despite this, many of the people here say that they are ecstatic. Muhammad, a father of 4, told me that he is very happy to be out of eastern Aleppo, describing the situation in the western sector of the city as heaven when compared to the constant violence he witnessed along with his children in eastern Aleppo. More and more people continue to leave eastern Aleppo and come into government areas, and the resources are being more and more stretched. One aid worker told me that towards the beginning of the people coming into the shelter centers, they could afford to give 6 blankets to each individual. Now they can only give 4 blankets, and it is freezing here in this part of Aleppo in this time of the year. Syrian government officials told us that there are over 30,000 civilians who have already crossed from rebel-held districts of Aleppo into the government-controlled parts of the city in the past 10 days, since the Syrian army started making gains and taking more districts out of the control of the rebels, though these districts have been under the control of the rebels since July 2012, when rebels first moved in on Aleppo and took over half of the city. And now the fighting is taking place on the outskirts of the citadel of Aleppo, further kindling fears that more of the ancient parts of Aleppo could be destroyed. Large parts of the old city of Aleppo has been listed on the UNESCO's World Heritage lists, and some of these World Heritage sites have been destroyed, like the ancient souk of the city, which dates back to over 2,000 years. All of this is happening at a time when the Syrian army is progressing and continuing with its military operation and gaining more momentum as it advances on the remaining rebel districts. But despite the momentum that the Syrian army is gaining, rebel factions operating in the remaining areas under their control have united all their groups under one group under the name of Aleppo Army. The new faction is expected to gather as many as 7,000 fighters, including fighters from Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate known as Jabhat al-Nusra. Rebel commanders have vowed to continue fighting and not to surrender the remaining parts of Aleppo to the hands of government forces. Back to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Ala. That's CCTV's Ala Ibrahim reporting from Aleppo. Let's go to our panel now. Alexander Nekrasov is a Russian policy analyst and former advisor to the Kremlin. He joins us from London. And with us here in Washington is Shlomo Boltz. He's the policy and advocacy officer at the Syrian American Council. He Wenping is the Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She joins us from Beijing. And with us from Damascus is Syrian journalist Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, let's go to you first in Damascus. You're on the ground. It does look like the Syrian government will take back Aleppo. Would that be the turning point in this war, which has been raging since 2011?
the Syrian army is determined to take control of the entire city of Aleppo. Of course, here we're speaking about the eastern part where the fighting is happening in general. The Syrian government is now in control of over 65% of the eastern parts of Aleppo that were under the occupation of terrorist groups, mainly the Al-Nusra Front and other groups like Nuruddin al-Zinki. Since 2012, now 65% are liberated by the Syrian army. There are about less than 20 square kilometers of eastern Aleppo under the control of the armed groups. Now, Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim in his latest press conference made it clear that the Syrian army and the Syrian government made the decision and are determined to secure the city from foreign-backed militants, and this is what is actually happening. In only 1 week, the Syrian army was able to secure over 30 quarters in eastern Aleppo, and in parallel with the Syrian army's advance over there, the civilians were able to get out of those areas. Civilians who have been used by those terrorists as human shields, they were prevented by those armed groups to leave those areas when the Syrian government called on them to leave and allowed and set several humanitarian corridors for that. They were prevented over 3 times by the terrorists to leave. So definitely the situation is becoming better for the sake of the civilians, at least when we speak about the civilians' interest inside the eastern parts of Aleppo.
Shlomo, I want to go to you. The rebels seem to have been fighting amongst themselves a little bit before this offensive. That a lot of people are saying has weakened the defences of Aleppo. What's the situation on the ground in terms of the rebel forces in Aleppo, and are they going to be pushed out, do you think?
Well, it's certainly true that there has been some infighting among the rebels. However, far more important than that factor, my friend from Syria mentioned foreign fighters, but in fact the main foreign fighters who are involved in the battle for Aleppo is the Harakat al-Nujaba militia. It's run by Sheikh Akram al-Ka'bi, who has openly said Aleppo should be a Shiite city. He says that we're fighting the grandsons of Muawiyah, so he sees it purely in sectarian terms. And thousands of Iraqi Shiite fighters entering to Iran actually left the fight against ISIS in Iraq because they needed to fight the so-called terrorists in Aleppo city. And they're not actually terrorists. Nuruddin Zenki, which he mentioned, actually has fought ISIS on far greater frequency than the Syrian government has. Nuruddin Zenki is right now in the suburbs of Aleppo fighting with Turkey in the Euphrates Shield Coalition against ISIS, and they have made rapid gains. Their situation is deteriorating. That's because of heavy Russian involvement and heavy Iranian involvement, the fierce bombardments of Russia, especially with bunker busters, which they introduced after reinstating the siege in September. They have had an impact. It's possible that the city will fall, but if so, it's not going to improve the situation for civilians.
So let's break this down. You're saying on the side, of course, we have Iraqi Shiite fighters, Lebanese, Iranians as well, but also the Russians. Alex Zanonakrossov in London. If Aleppo falls to the Damascus government, this is a big victory for Russia, but also a loss for the United States, correct?
Well, to be honest, I don't understand why we are talking about the fall of Aleppo as if that would end the civil war in Syria. That would be obviously a tactical victory for Assad and his supporters, but why would we conclude that that would be sort of the beginning of the end of the conflict in Syria? Don't forget, the reason why eastern Aleppo withstood such fierce attacks was because it was getting arms. It was continued to get supplies and arms from outside. There was no way the rebels would have been able to withstand the attack of the Syrian government forces. So let's keep this in mind. Secondly, I find it quite distasteful that the Western media is now trying to portray and basically cover up the facts that are surfacing daily now. Now that we have the civilians from eastern Aleppo escaping to the government-controlled area, they are sharing their stories of what was really going on in eastern Aleppo and how they were kept hostage by the so-called rebels in there, and how they were used and are still being used as human shields. And yet, we had reports from Western media saying that some of these civilians were actually shot at and killed by the Russian and Syrian forces when they tried to escape. This sort of propaganda has to stop.
I want to go to Beijing, but Shlomo, you were shaking your head there, so I'll let you...
I just want to say Russia's been doing this for the past month. Sir, your propaganda is the main propaganda that's involved in Syria. For the past month, you've been spreading these rumors that, oh, civilians are trying to flee Aleppo. Russia TV, RT, put out a video saying, oh, these are civilians fleeing Aleppo, and they were holding the flag of a rebel group, and they were chanting, this is Aleppo. So you're spreading outright lies about the situation in Aleppo now. If you're saying people are trying to leave, they're not trying to leave. The only reason they left is because Russian bombing has made it impossible for them to stay. So they're just fleeing anywhere they want to. And even some people, the Syrian guy shaking his head now, I see, but some of the people who fled to regime areas haven't been heard from. Amnesty International is warning of mass disappearances. It's already happened in Masak and Hanano, the first area that the government conquered in Aleppo in this current offensive. 500 young men have gone missing. We don't know where they are. So that's what they're fleeing to. They're not fleeing voluntarily.
There's lots of shaking of heads and disagreeing. I think one thing we can agree on is the humanitarian crisis in Syria does continue. I want to go to Beijing and He Jinping because China has tried to sort of mediate a little bit here, but has in the UN Security Council backed the Russian position and with it the Assad position. What's China's view of what's going on in Aleppo and the potential turning point here in the civil war?
Well, China's stance is quite clear. First, we have been long insisted on political solution to all this issue of Syria crisis. And secondly, given the consideration of the humanitarian crisis in Aleppo, because the fighting has been going on there, no matter what kind of saying given by both sides, but the fact is people living in that city, they have been suffering. That's the fact. So we have been offering a humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. They have been suffering from this civil crisis for such a long time, 6 years already. So that's the basic policy China has been doing. So to my understanding, I think Aleppo war, of course, that should be a turning point for this 6-year-long Syria war. We see because the Aleppo city is such a strategic city, not only for its communication importance, because it's bordered with Turkey, and it has been served as very important, even the only one access for those forces, anti-government forces of Syria, and based that city to get all those aid and equipment from the outside of the territory. So if that city has been taken over by the Syria government, of course, that will show not symbolically, but also practically means now the Syria government has gaining the upper hand.
Mohammed Ali, gaining the upper hand, do you think that's come from Russia's involvement since September 2015?
Well, definitely Russia's involvement in the war on terrorism assisted the Syrian army and gave it the upper hand against terrorist groups, not only in Aleppo, but also in areas like Hama, Deir el-Zor, and many other areas like Latakia countryside. However, now the main topic is Aleppo for sure. I would just like to comment on what one of your guests said about that the civilians did not want to get out of Aleppo. This is not true. I don't know if your guest was watching TV when those civilians got out of Aleppo. They were saying while they were getting out, those families, those terrorists inside starved us to death. When the humanitarian aid goes in, the terrorists take such aid for themselves or sell it for the civilians with high prices, and they use them as human shields also over there inside. They prevented them from getting out when the Syrian army opened humanitarian corridors over there for the civilians. Also, we have to point out a very important point, which is that the Syrian army is not alone in Aleppo now. It has other allies. There is Hezbollah Hezbollah, you have Russia fighting also from the air. So definitely, after the Syrian army was able to impose a tight siege on the eastern parts of Aleppo, the power is undermined for those terrorists. They have no supply lines from Turkey. They have no supply line for getting in reinforcements, weapons, or arms.
Thank you. I just want to bring in Shlomo here. Does it seem now that the US has essentially given up on backing any forces in Syria? It doesn't seem that because of the change of administration that there is any support there for the rebels.
I don't think the U.S., even under the current administration, has been backing rebels in a real substantial way for a long time, especially in northern Syria. This was well documented in 2014, where there were very large anti-ISIS groups. Before even Nusra was a major player, Syrian Revolutionaries Front was the main group in Idlib, and Harakat Hazm was very powerful in the Aleppo suburbs, and they reported receiving only a couple dozen bullets a month. You can't fight with that. They reported they had tanks they couldn't even drive because the U.S. wouldn't give them the oil. And of course, you remember the train and equip program where they sent in under 40, 60 fighters or something like that without sufficient weapons and without any air cover whatsoever. So yes, Nusra has some bad tendencies. They like to pick off the more moderate groups when they can, and we're seeing some of that now even. But the basic problem, the reason why you have such a strong presence for extremist groups is the U.S. never really supported the moderate rebels as they should have. And that actually could change with the next administration. It could not, or maybe it will. It's not easy to say.
I'm glad you said that, because that's what I want to get to after the break. But we do have to take a break. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the ongoing conflict in Syria. I'd like to pick up with one of our guests, Alexander Nekrasov, former Kremlin advisor, coming today from London. Just before the break, we were talking about the US not supporting the rebel factions. The US has also said, though, that if Russia and Assad win, that they could impose costs on Syria and Russia. And do you feel these are empty threats of an outgoing Obama administration, and really the US position internationally is being weakened by this conflict, Alex?
Well, we currently have two presidents in Washington. They're saying the completely opposite things. So it's very difficult for people in the Kremlin and in Moscow to really understand what is going on. But I'd like to pick up on that point that the Americans were not supporting rebels in Syria properly. I find this, you know, just laughable, because these rebels would not have lasted a day without any help from outside. The whole Aleppo tragedy is that these rebels were equipped enough to hold 275,000 people hostage, not forgetting about several hundred Western advisors who were held hostage as well and couldn't get out of there. And we are now told that they are not getting enough help from America, that they're getting a dozen bullets from America, they're getting tanks without no oil from America. Excuse me, what is it, a war of media propaganda, or is it a fairy tale? The point of the Syrian conflict is that a lot of outside countries are meddling in this conflict. I'm not saying that, you know, it's just one-sided conflict. We have so many sides, it's confusing. But the problem is that it's more a war of the media outlets than it's a war, you know, where we know the real situation on the ground. Excuse me, if we are going to debate on such a level, then it's not a debate. That's a propaganda war. We are back to Libya, by the way, which was Libya was played exactly the same way.
Things. It's only a propaganda war. There's no facts. That's classic Russian tactics. That's how Putin's in power in Moscow also. That's how you acquainted.
Excuse me.
How do you think Putin came to power?
In Libya, you already
Chechnya, remember that?
Okay.
You know,
I understand you disagree. I understand, Shlomo, Alex, I understand you both disagree, and it's good, but we're getting slightly off point here. So to calm things down, I'm going to He Wenping in Beijing, who's always a voice of reason. Let's step back up a little bit. And, what do you think the consequences of the rebels potentially losing in Syria is for the United States, both in the region of the Middle East and, of course, internationally as well?
I think now there are several developing trends happening in that region. First of all, we have seen the changes in the White House with this election of Mr. Trump, and according to his statements and his words about the Syria, and also he's going to develop a good relation with Russia, with President Putin. So I think there will be a policy change given by the White House in the coming year. So that will also help the Russian side and also the Syria, the Assad regime. That's for sure. Another thing is the war on the ground. For example, this Aleppo war. To take the Aleppo over by the Syrian government, it seems just a matter of the time. So with this retake of the Aleppo, of course, the Syrian government will further strengthen its regime power, and also that will gain strengthen its bargaining chips whenever there is to resume the negotiation talk. So that's also for sure. And then we see recently the Egypt even shifted its support very clearly to the Assad regime. So that's another, I think, help to the Syrian government. So we see very clearly nowadays there is, of course, this war in Syria is no longer just the war between the Syrian government and the anti-government forces. It's becoming a regional war, and also maybe we call it a proxy war. So a lot of big powers now get involved in. So now we see very clearly that is the Russian camp, and together with Iran, together now with Egypt, and I think even the Turkish relation with Russia also get something very interesting.
Yes.
They are closer and closer, but of course, to top down the Assad regime is still the big differences.
Muhammad Ali in Damascus, from where you're standing, does President Bashar al-Assad feel more confident, obviously, of Donald Trump becoming US president? And what would his continued hold on power mean for the region?
Well, regarding the Syrian government stance towards Donald Trump's policy, let's say, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said it many times in two recent interviews he made with Western media outlets that it depends on the policy that will be implemented after Donald Trump gets into office, not depending on the statements that he makes during his electoral campaign, because according to the Syrian president, what he said is that the Syrian officials don't take the statements of the Americans seriously, because they always do contrary to what they say. And of course, also, if Donald Trump is serious about his policy that fighting ISIL is a priority, not toppling President Assad, and that he will be working with Russia, if Donald Trump is serious about this policy but implementing it, will he be able to implement it? This would also be a very important question according to President Bashar al-Assad, because there are a lot of political currents and parties inside the US that will not allow him, perhaps. Right. So we will still have to wait and see what will happen.
Shlomo, I want to bring you in. A Trump administration seemingly more pro-Kremlin, pro-Assad.
That's true, but on the flip side, also more anti-Iran. And remember that while it is true that each side is sending support. Saudi Arabia is sending support, they're sending supplies. And meanwhile, Iran is sending support, they're sending senior generals who die in conflict. They're not hiding it. Qasem Soleimani has gone to the very front lines. Akram al-Kabi of Harakat al-Nujaba has been on the front lines in Aleppo. There's never been any sort of a visit like that by a Saudi military official or a Turkish military official. What's the consequences of that with the Trump administration? While he's pro-Putin, he also has a lot of people who understand what the Iranian regime really is, that they're not, pro-peace, that they're not a force for stability in the region, that they're the #1 state sponsor of terror, which is what the State Department has called them, even under this administration. So it's quite possible that given the essential role of Iranian militias, Assad would be dead by now now, if it weren't for the Iranian militias, it's quite possible that Trump will push back.
I take your point about
that.
Iran intervening at a stage where a lot of people weren't and helping there. Alex, in London, do you see the Trump administration making an agreement with Moscow to bring this war to some sort of end and keep Assad in place in Damascus?
Well, unfortunately, we have to wait and see, because there's absolutely no point in discussing what is going to happen until we have two presidents, as I said, and Obama is doing, one thing, Trump is sort of hinting at another thing. We don't yet really know what his team will be about. So it's a wait-and-see situation. And it's quite a confusing situation, by the way. The only thing I think that we hopefully will see change is that China, which is never mentioned in Western reports as being in support of the Russian position, by the way. Have you noticed, everybody, how nobody mentions China when they talk about, voting in the Security Council and so on? I hope that China will start playing a more active role now, because it really, really needs its voice to be heard now. Because we always seem to think that it's only Russia in the Security Council against all the, civilized world. No, China is on the side of Russia. And I hope China will be more vocal on Syria and generally on the Middle East.
A point well taken. Final word, He Wenpeng. Is China going to get more involved in conflicts like this, mediating or otherwise?
Well, as I mentioned before, China hasn't involved very much like sending military troops to join the fighting in Syria. That's not the things Chinese government has been doing, and I don't see the possibility for that trend either. But we have yes, diplomatically we support Russia's stance, and we also work together with Russia to push forward those negotiations back on the track. But unfortunately, those negotiation process has been disrupted again and again and again. But I also mentioned China now becoming active in providing humanitarian help to the Syrian people. They suffered from those war. I think because different with Russia's approach, because Russia has been directly involved into the fighting in the Syria, but China, because we have the quite different background and quite different policy in terms of involved with foreign those war in those kind of way, direct way.
Okay.
And plus the distance you see is quite far away.
Yes, I wish we could talk more, but unfortunately we've run out of time. He Wenpeng in Beijing, thank you very much. Alexander Nekrasov, of course, in London. Also, Muhammad Ali in Damascus and Shlomo Boltz here. Thank you so much for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation does continue online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.